Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Ivory Coast's election campaign kicks off, but opposition candidates call on their supporters to boycott the process. What that means exactly is hard to say. We hear more from our correspondent in Bouaké. Also, Guinea's economic crisis is a top issue in the country's electoral race. The polls on Sunday, and the main challenger of President Alpha Condé is hoping that the leader's shaky economic record will see a push for change at the voting booth. And Cameroon still keeping up its push against polio, despite being declared free of the disease earlier this year. A new vaccination drive has been launched in response to a few new cases of type 2 polio, which have been found in parts of the country. Now, ahead of Ivory Coast's 10th October 31st presidential election, the opposition has asked supporters to boycott the electoral process. Their fears that the objection to President Alassane Ouattara's bid for a controversial third term could lead to clashes. Official campaigning began on Thursday, with 4 candidates in total in the running. Nicolas Chemin has more.
Henri Conan-Bédier and Pascal Afine-Guessant have called for an active boycott of the electoral process, but Ivory Coast's 2 main opposition leaders have not withdrawn their candidacies.
We have decided to tell all of our voters and supporters that we don't recognize this ongoing electoral process, that this electoral process is illegal because it does not meet any international criteria, and that our supporters, just like the Ivorian voters, should abstain from participating.
They said this on the first day of the campaign. The election will be held on the 31st of October. President Alassane Ouattara's allies reacted to their statement on France 24.
Ces candidats se sont déplacés pour aller déposer leur candidature auprès donc de cette commission électorale indépendante. Cela veut dire quoi? Si vous ne voulez pas aller à des élections, si vous n'avez pas confiance en cette institution, pourquoi alors vous déplacez pour aller déposer vos candidatures?
The opposition says Ouattara's candidacy is illegal. In Ivory Coast, a president can only do 2 terms, and Ouattara is finishing his second. A new constitution was adopted 4 years ago. Ouattara's party has argued that it reset the limit on the number of terms. The atmosphere is currently tense in Ivory Coast. Regional bloc ECOWAS said it was very concerned by the growing use of hate speech in the country. In August, a dozen people were killed during protests against Ouattara's candidacy.
Well, the opposition candidates who have called for a boycott of the electoral process in Ivory Coast haven't gone as far as saying that they'll pull out of the election. Sam Bradpeace tells us more.
Just seen there, this electoral campaign has got off to a slightly strange start. The 2 main opposition candidates have called for a boycott of the electoral process, but they've stopped short of withdrawing their candidacies and calling for a complete boycott of the election altogether. All of that might sound quite vague to you, but it's perhaps how the opposition want it to sound, nice and vague. Because, of course, if they called for a complete boycott of the elections altogether, if the president then won with a landslide majority, then they would have no ground to fall back on. The government could turn around and say, well, look, you've missed your chance to compete for power democratically. It's worth remembering that the opposition are extremely angry with President Ouattara's bid for a third term, which they judge to be illegal. They're also angry with the fact that Ouattara controls most of the country's electoral institutions, at least the Constitutional Court. Now, the opposition had previously called for a campaign of civil disobedience. Very little has come of that so far. But with their new calls for supporters to prevent campaign rallies from happening, we're now beginning perhaps to have a slightly clearer idea of what that civil disobedience might entail.
Sam Bradpeace there for us. Now, Guinea's president returned to lobby supporters in Conakry on Thursday in the final push ahead of Sunday's election. Weeks of combative campaigning have followed months of political unrest and protests against 82-year-old Alpha Condé's re-election bid. His main challenger is Cellou Dalein Diallo, who's already lost 2 elections to Condé. Diallo has pointed to the country's economic crisis, which has worsened under the pandemic, as a sign that it is time for a change at the top. Our correspondents have more.
Medina is the largest market in Conakry, where thousands of Guineans come every day to man stalls or do their shopping. As the presidential election approaches, voter expectation is high. Boubacar, a salesman, hopes that youth employment will be the winner's priority.
La Medina ici, il y a beaucoup de jeunes, ce sont des universités, sortant des universités, bon, diplômés sans emploi, ils viennent à Medina ici pour se débrouiller. D'autres font taxi-moto, donc parce qu'il n'y a pas de travail. Oui, il n'y a pas de travail. Donc quand on voit un nouveau président, il n'a qu'à voir le travail des jeunesses là aussi.
More than half of the Guinean population lives below the poverty line, according to the World Bank, a situation made worse by the health crisis as food prices soared due to COVID-19. This family on the outskirts of Conakry wants to see their purchasing power increase.
Quand tu payes 1 kilo de viande à 50 000 francs guinéens et puis quand tu veux faire une sauce, tu vas dépenser éventuellement 100 000 francs guinéens. C'est pas du tout facile pour nous quand même. Et le poisson, tout coûte cher à l'heure là. Et j'aimerais vraiment que le nouveau président fasse quelque chose pour ça.
Despite its rich mining sector, 62 years after its independence, Guinea is still struggling to really take off. For this entrepreneur who works in the health and hygiene sector, the country's priority should be to strengthen the rule of law.
Moi, particulièrement, c'est d'abord le respect des lois, une justice sociale pour tous, l'éducation et la santé. Les infrastructures, ça viendra après. Parce que quels que soient les moyens que vous mettez dans les infrastructures sanitaires, hôtelières et autres, si les gens ne sont pas éduqués, mais qui va les utiliser? Personne.
Guinea sits near the bottom of the United Nations Human Development Index, ranking 175th out of 189 countries, a sign that the future president still has a lot to do to improve the country's standards.
Look now at some news in brief. At least 20 people have been killed in attacks by armed gangs on 3 villages in northern Burkina Faso. The raids in the commune of Gorgadji happened on Wednesday, just 10 days after gunmen killed 25 displaced people near the town of Pisila. Extremist attacks have been on the rise in the country over the last few years, and hundreds have been killed this year alone. More than 1 in 20 people have been forced from their homes by the violence. South Africa's president unveiled an economic recovery plan for the country that will see big spending on infrastructure, over 50 billion euros worth over the next 4 years. That Cyril Ramaphosa hopes will create more than 800,000 jobs. Unemployment is currently at a record high of 42%. In the meantime, COVID-19 relief grants for the out of work that were brought in March are due to be extended for another 3 months. They are initially to run for 6 months. Tanzania's asked for firefighting helicopters and planes to help battle a blaze raging on Africa's tallest mountain. About 500 volunteers have been struggling to contain the fire on Mount Kilimanjaro. It first broke out on Sunday, and emergency teams have made some progress in controlling the spread of the flames until they were reignited by strong winds on Wednesday. Now, Cameroon is still keeping up efforts to stamp out polio, despite being declared free of the disease earlier this year. New cases of type 2 polio have since cropped up in some parts of the country where few children are immunised. A new vaccination drive's recently been launched. Our team reports.
Infants crying in a hospital in Yaoundé. They are being vaccinated against polio. A vaccination campaign is underway in Cameroon, despite it having been declared polio-free only a few months ago. But all types of the disease have not been eliminated.
Le Cameroun a été déclaré free de poliomyélite. Cependant, les souches environnementaux ont été découverts. Et compte tenu du fait qu'on voudrait protéger la population d'une future épidémie, on a décidé de faire des campagnes de vaccination contre la poliomyélite.
Mobile teams have been dispatched to several districts in the capital to inoculate as many children as possible. Polio attacks the nervous system and can cause irreversible paralysis. In 2018, there were only about 30 cases worldwide. On the ground, some parents try to stop the medical teams from treating their children. They are mistakenly worried that the kids are being given COVID-19. Team leader Isidore Ekobo says misinformation like this can be dangerous.
Beaucoup de parents pensent qu'on vient plutôt inoculer la Covid à leurs enfants. Or, c'est un vaccin qui est vraiment important parce qu'un enfant qui atteint le polio, c'est irréversible.
Despite her initial doubt, health workers have convinced Vanessa to let her 3 children be vaccinated.
Au départ, j'ai eu peur que c'était une phase contre le coronavirus. Mais bien après, j'ai compris que non, c'était pour prévenir la polio. Et c'est pour ça que j'ai accepté qu'on vaccine mes enfants.
More campaigns are planned for the coming months to prevent a resurgence of polio. The goal is to vaccinate nearly 5 million babies and children up to 5 years old.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care.
Special events.
It's one of those events you cannot ignore. Every 4 years, all eyes are on the White House. Donald Trump or Joe Biden? Who will America pick as its next president? Will the Republican incumbent stay in office, or will his Democratic rival unseat him? Throughout the campaign, our correspondents and guests will discuss the issues at the heart of the election.
Follow election results in our special edition beginning on the 3rd of November on France 24.